Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today is April the 12th, 2026, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it. We'll talk about it. Another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well. Yourself?
I can't complain.
Well, we can help. There's a lot of things to complain about, but Hungary is not one of them. People are cheering about that. We can touch on that in a bit. The Artemis mission was a big success, so you can't really complain about that. They all made it back alive, and the ship did its job. Did you see any of that?
Excuse me. Yeah, I saw that.
Mm-hmm.
Everything seemed to go according to plan. I think I did read an article about their plans for the future. They are planning to go to the moon and to build a moon base, but that's probably a ways off. Lots of delays in the program, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was reading that one of the delays involves refueling spacecraft in orbit, apparently, because they want to send a lot of equipment for the moon base. And the way they're going to get the fuel that they need up in orbit is just to fire it up incrementally. And then they're going to load it up into the spacecraft that eventually does make its way to the moon to set up the base. But that's going to involve taking the fuel in orbit and then transferring it to the spacecraft. And that's apparently very technically challenging from what I read.
Mm.
And there are lots of delays in trying to get it right.
I see. Yeah, that sounds pretty tricky for sure. I'm guessing you need the refueling because getting into orbit is very costly for fuel because you have to fight against the gravity where it's most intense. But once you're in orbit, you're chilling and it takes relatively less, but still a substantial amount to get to the moon. And the difference would be if you're trying to move enough for a base, that's a lot more than moving for humans. So
Yeah.
you would need a lot more real estate in the spaceship.
Yeah, therein lies the problem. Apparently, NASA has contracts out with two private companies to develop the lunar lander that they're going to use, and there are lots of delays with those as well. They have to be much bigger than the lander used back in the 60s and 70s because they're actually landing a lot more stuff. Like you say, it takes a lot of equipment to build a moon base. So that's apparently a big technical challenge as well.
Mm.
Yeah, the original objective was to start going to the moon annually starting in 2028 and to start building the base, I guess, in 29, 30, something like that. But more likely it's going to get delayed by probably several years. So it'll be a long time.
Mm.
But it is in the works at least. Also, China's apparently planning to go to the moon in 2030.
Oh.
So that'll be fun.
To step on it or fly around it?
Now, they are actually going to land on it.
Oh.
I think they've actually already flown around it, if I'm not mistaken. I think they launched that mission a while back.
Hmm. Well, I feel like if China does stuff, then that'll get us moving again because the strongest force in motivating the space program is rivalry. It's not research or
Yeah,
science, so.
yeah, historically it's been relevant, but I don't know how much it's going to move people now.
Hmm.
As we've talked about before, Sino-American competition doesn't really seem to be a big driving force in so much as its presence at all.
Hmm.
You know what China calls their astronauts?
Hmm.
Taikonauts.
Techonauts.
Taikonauts.
Oh. Hmm.
Yeah, we've got astronauts. The Russians have cosmonauts. The Chinese have taikonauts.
And what are the Canadians?
I suspect they use astronaut as well.
Ah.
Well, have you done anything exciting this week?
I started running again. I'm doing like 3 mile route, and it's gotten easier every time, but running at mile high plus altitude is pretty strenuous, and then that plus uphill plus gravel terrain instead of like sidewalk. It's definitely a exciting experience.
Sounds challenging.
Yeah.
But I guess it's good for you, right?
Mm-hmm. I generally feel better just as soon as I start my day with a stream. If I've run, I feel like fully awake and alert. Sometimes if I don't exercise in any way and I get started, kind of like a slug, just making mistakes, slowly moving, not really pointed at the task that's in front of me, just do. But if you run, your body is in a state of, am I gonna die? So you really get a sense of your wakefulness for that day.
Wow. Well, honing your body is a strenuous process.
Yep. But it pays dividends.
Well, I did do that walk, by the way.
Ah, good work. Is Texas
Got a
back
nice
in
little
summer
rain.
now?
Oh, sorry, what?
Is Texas back in summer now? Or
It's more spring, I think. You know how it is. It gets a little rainy. It's getting warmer, but it's not mega hot yet.
mm-hmm.
Sort of that transitional period.
Yeah, the wet season.
There you go. Yeah, it actually rained while I was walking, which was nice. Very pleasant. Not a heavy rain at first, just sort of a light sprinkle.
Yeah, and for those who don't know about Texas, it's going to be relatively warmer temperature. It's not like British or Seattle rain, where it's like rainy and cold. I don't think you'd be like, oh yeah, the rain and cold's really nice. Maybe you're into that, I don't know.
Yeah, rain is fantastic in Texas. It's always nice and welcome, especially in the summer months. We really don't get enough of it.
Randomly, chat's asking if either of us saw Project Hail Mary. I did not see it.
Project Hail Mary?
Yeah, it's a sci-fi movie based on a book. I've read the first quarter of the book.
I've not seen it.
Ryan Gosling. Oh yeah, I missed out on the joke because I was spaced on the actor's name. But when you were talking about the shuttle that would go to set up a base on the moon would need to refuel in orbit, but refueling a vessel in orbit is a difficult task. I was like, why don't you just get Matthew McConaughey to do it? He did it in Interstellar. That's not possible. No, it's necessary. Oh my gosh, Matthew McConaughey. That's what we needed.
It's a good movie.
Yep.
Well, my week has been very quiet and bland.
Oh.
Still helping take care of my relative, playing through Death Stranding, following the news, etc. Pretty routine.
I watched a couple-hour interview with Afro Man talking about the case and some of his backstory. Yeah, he played it smart. He was talking about, for all of the diss tracks that he did of the people who raided his home, he did his research on all of them and only said things about them that were either clearly a joke or they were legit convicted of. So, yeah, he definitely played his cards right for the situation and came out ahead with a lot more notoriety than he's had in recent years, so that's good.
Several hours.
2-hour
That's
interview.
it's a long interview.
Yeah.
It's a very modern thing. I'm still not entirely used to it. When I was a young John Smith, when you watched an interview on the news, it was like 15, 20 minutes at most.
Mm-hmm.
So the new podcast age of multi-hour interviews and content still seems a little strange to me, but I guess it's normal now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Things change, I guess.
Well, I would guess that the Iran situation is one of the bigger things that'll take a while. But we could do some other stuff first if you wanted. Like the Hungary election was big.
Yeah, we could do Hungary first. Let's see. Well, it's pretty straightforward. Hungary had an election. Viktor Orban and Fidesz, I'm not sure how to pronounce his party's name. They've been in power for 16 years. They're the most successful and prominent of Europe's various, what academics call illiberal Democrats, basically. Political actors whom nominally believe in democracy and uphold democratic institutions, but don't really respect the soft norms and institutions that uphold democracy. In other words, they tend to bend the rules very, very heavily in their favor. So it's not quite democracy, but it's not quite authoritarianism. It's something in between, and that's generally referred to as illiberalism. So Orban has been easily the most identifiable of the illiberals within European politics over the past couple decades. And he's known for, besides, bending rules and norms and whatnot, he's also known in foreign policy for being fairly Russophile overall. Tends to be very skeptical of support to Ukraine, prefers good ties with Russia, especially in terms of energy flows. And also is very skeptical of the European Union, although it doesn't stop him from taking their money, naturally. He prefers maximal autonomy, not necessarily for Hungary as a whole, but just more so for his state. And he very much came to conflate himself with the Hungarian state. So to him and Fidesz, they were pretty much indistinguishable. So there's been many elections in Hungary over the past 16 years, and there was always strong criticism of Orban from Hungary's opposition, but they've never been able to band it together to overcome Fidesz's popularity. If you don't know the background, populists had not really had a lot of currency in Hungarian politics after Hungary, I don't want to say became independent, that's not quite the right word, but after Hungary democratized and left the Eastern Bloc, so to speak, at the end of the Cold War. There was a pretty active and successful center-left and center-right scene, so to speak, in Hungarian politics. And they kind of alternated power for a while. I think Orban actually was a pretty prominent centrist in that time, if I'm not mistaken. And then eventually, there came a period of stagnation, especially in the mid-late aughts, when the Hungarian economy wasn't really growing, and the Hungarian government was kind of stuck. It didn't really matter whether people voted center-left or center-right. It didn't seem like any of the establishment parties were really meeting the moment. There was a lot of pressure to reduce government spending, and that resulted in a lot of unpopular initiatives by both center-left and center-right. And there was also a lot of populism linked to immigration that was increasing at that time. This is the time of the Syrian civil war, when there was a lot of Syrians flooding in, as well as other peoples from other parts of the world, like Afghanistan, Iran, sub-Saharan Africa to a lesser degree. And so the influx of immigrants kind of set people off. So that, combined with the economic malaise, sort of set the foundation for the emergence of a successful populist political actor, such as Orban. One of the major catalyzing events occurred just before Fidesz took power, I want to say in 2011. So this would have been like 2010 or whenever. The center-left was in power at the time, and they had won election campaigning against a push by the previous center-right government to implement austerity politics to deal with chronic budget deficits, economic malaise, etc. And the center-left came in promising not to do that, but then there was a leak of an email within the government that revealed that they were actually planning on making cuts because they didn't think they could come up with any way to avoid it. And a lot of people saw that as a betrayal, and that basically, what's the word I want? Delegitimized both the center-left and center-right establishment parties in Hungary. It didn't seem like any of them had any of the solutions that the public was looking for. So, as often happens when publics want things that they can't have, they turn to populists who promise to deliver. And so that was the return of Viktor Orban to the prime minister's office and the onset of Fidesz rule, which would then last for the better part of 16 years. So that's kind of the background. And after he came to power, he actually won a supermajority in 2011, and his party was able to change not only various laws in ways that favored incumbents, specifically his party, but they also changed the Hungarian constitution to further deepen the incumbent advantage in the electoral system. I've got some notes on some of the changes that they made, and I'll kind of get into that. But for now, sticking with the background, basically the summary is that it was very difficult after that for the opposition to coordinate sufficiently to challenge Fidesz and remove him from power. And the opposition failed for various reasons. Partly is just because they were disunited, partly it was because of ideological differences, partly it was pressure from Orban's government. So it was a combination of things, not necessarily any individual thing by itself. So that brings us to the last couple of years. There has been the emergence in that time of a new opposition coalition called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation again, TIZE, I think. TIZE, something to that effect. And so the innovation of this new opposition force is that rather than being explicitly not only anti-Orban, but also explicitly left-wing, or at least centrist, this new party is actually center-right, or maybe even just explicitly right-wing. The leader of the party is actually a former Fidesz member. He defected from the party over a scandal, some years ago. So he's a former government insider, and his perspective basically is that he wants to do a lot of the popular things that Orban did, especially vis-a-vis immigration, but he wants to do it without the personalistic style of politics, basically without the illiberal bent of the Orban administration. So this does not mark an ideological sea change in the disposition of Hungary as a country. It's still going to be fairly conservative. However, it could mark a course correction in terms of democratic culture writ large within Hungary and shift the country away from Orban's sort of style. We'll see if they actually follow through with that. But TIZE kind of painted itself as an opposition that was an umbrella organization, an umbrella movement that encompassed not only dissident Fidesz members, but also the opposition left and other various figures and movements within Hungary. So it's basically the anti-Orban party. That's the genesis of it, and that's the gist of it. So they're the ones who ran as the main opposition in the election that was held just recently, in the past 48 hours. And in the last election before this, the opposition had done relatively well, but they'd still lost. And it wasn't clear if that might not happen again. And as we've discovered in the past 48 hours, not only has Tizé actually defeated Fidesz and Viktor Orban, they actually won a supermajority, which is a much stronger showing than I had been expecting. So this is a major victory here for the opposition. Again, it's not going to be a big ideological change, but Viktor Orban will be out of power for the first time in more than a decade. And that's a big shift. And the fact that they won a supermajority is actually even more significant. We talked a little bit about this, I think, a week or two ago, which is that because Fidesz had changed the constitution, they had actually institutionalized aspects of their rule that would actually survive a change in power. And the only way to undo that would have been a supermajority, which I had discounted because I thought that was asking too much. Fidesz still retains a pretty strong base of support, but I was wrong. They actually did pull off a supermajority, which means that if they can get the votes together, they will be able to change the Hungarian constitution and undo the changes that Orban's party has inflicted on the country over the past decade plus. So it's not just a victory for the opposition, it's actually a crushing victory. This is a very significant shift in direction for Hungarian politics. So that was the big news out of Hungary. Pretty dramatic stuff if you're Hungarian. We'll see if it lasts. My experience with populists in various countries is that they tend to come back. And that was my experience and observation even before Trump got a second term in office. They do not tend to disappear. So much will depend on how well Tisza manages to govern. We'll see how that goes. But for now, the fact that they're going to get a chance at all is the big news. So that said, this was a good excuse then to talk about illiberal democracy and the kinds of legal changes that illiberal Democrats like Viktor Orban make in order to solidify their hold on power. So I'm just going to run through quickly here some of the notes I took on individual changes that Fidesz made while it was in power. Among the constitutional changes that were made, and this again was 2011, and the changes that I'm going to talk about here are not the only changes they made. These were just some of the more prominent ones that I encountered when reading about this, but they apparently changed hundreds of laws. So this is just a small sample size here. One you can probably guess is gerrymandering. A lot of systems in Europe don't actually have single district voting. Hungary is kind of included in that, but they do have a system that's mixed in nature. And that's actually also not uncommon in Europe. So about half of the seats in Hungary's parliament after the changes were comprised of single-member constituencies. But what changed because of the constitutional changes was that they were gerrymandered. Basically, the shape of the districts was changed to benefit Fidesz. They also passed some laws that forced hundreds of judges to retire, which created an opportunity for the party to appoint loyalists into those positions. Some of that ended up reversed because an EU court said that it violated its rules. And so Hungary's constitutional court ended up annulling parts of that legislation, but not all of it. This is kind of a weird one. So Orban's party actually expanded the franchise in Hungary to encompass ethnic Hungarians who lived abroad. So these are not expats. These are not Hungarian citizens who moved out of the country. These are actually foreign citizens of other countries whom are ethnically Hungarian. These people were given the right to vote in Hungary's elections. And they tend to support Orban. So this was done very explicitly to benefit him and his party. If you're wondering what sort of the rationale for this, there's a pretty strong strain of nationalism with Hungary that is still butthurt about Hungary losing a bunch of territory after World War I. Hungary's original borders, when it was part of Austria-Hungary, were much more expansive than what they are now. And the result of the shrinkage of Hungary in that time period means that there's a relatively sizable cohort of ethnic Hungarians that live beyond the borders of Hungary in other countries. So Hungarian nationalists have always dreamed of restoring that lost territory to Hungary, and expanding the franchise was a kind of mild step in that direction. Let's see, they also raised the minimum threshold for parties to enter parliament. In multi-party democracies, there's generally some minimum portion of the vote that you have to get before you will be given some number of seats in the legislature. And what you can do, if you're an incumbent, is raise that number so that small parties are basically crowded out, which in turn benefits your party, or at least larger parties, by giving them a larger share of seats than they might otherwise get if the legislature were allowed to be more representative. No runoffs. So this is another thing that they did. So they installed a single round winner-take-all system. And again, this is referring to the independent districts, as I understand it. So rather than having a runoff where the top two vote getters in a given district compete against each other, they just immediately assign the district to whoever gets the most gets the most votes in the first round. So that's beneficial in a multi-party democracy for an incumbent, especially a large party incumbent, because it means that all the different smaller parties competing with each other eat away their portion of the vote, such that it's very easy for a relatively large party to win the most votes and then in turn win the district. Japan actually does the same thing. It's been an established part of their electoral system for more than half a century now. And the LDP is quite happy to exploit the shit out of it to retain its control over the government. Yeah, Japan's politics are a whole other conversation, but in this regard, they're pretty similar to that of Hungary. In terms of institutions, like I mentioned before, the government changed rules to ensure that its appointees to various agencies within Hungary's government would actually stay on even if there was a change of government. Some of the institutions in question include the presidency, the State Audit Commission, the Electoral Commission, the Constitutional Courts, universities, and also the wider education sector. So a pretty broad base of residual institutional control that would outlast any potential change in government. The caveat is that this would only work out for them if the opposition did not win a 2/3 supermajority, which, as I mentioned before, is a bar that they actually did clear in the most recent election. So beyond constitutional changes, there's also just craven clientelism. There was a study done in 2018 on the election that was held then, specifically on common practices in small towns and villages in Hungary. Some of the things that Fidesz did include busing foreign, quote-unquote, Hungarians. These are the foreign citizens I mentioned before. They would be bussed in by the Hungarian state. Mostly I read from Western Ukraine, actually. There is a province of Western Ukraine that used to be a part of Hungary 100 years ago and still retains a notable ethnic Hungarian minority. And then there's also outright vote buying. They'll offer a bonus, quote unquote, of up to 10,000 florins, which is apparently about $30, to voters for casting their ballot, quote unquote, patriotically. Let's see, they've also been using emergency rule. The Hungarian government declared a state of emergency after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and this has apparently stayed in place since then. So a lot of Orbán's governance over the past couple of years has actually been rule by decree. There was a crackdown on civil society that mostly focused on George Soros. I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about George Soros, but his institutions are a part, or at least were a part, of Hungary's civil society, and the Hungarian government took the opportunity presented by Soros's unpopularity as an individual to crack down on a lot of dissenting institutions in the NGO sector. So, for example, Soros's Open Society Foundation had to shut its office in Budapest in 2018 due to pressure from the Hungarian government. And Soros's university, Central European University, had to move to Vienna in 2019 under similar conditions. The effect was not really to mitigate the influence of ultra-wealthy foreigners looking to seize control and undermine the Hungarian government. The purpose of that was to chill civil society. The reforms that were implemented affecting Soros's NGOs affected all NGOs in Hungary, but the Hungarian government tried to build public support for it by focusing disproportionately on George Soros. As far as the media, and as far as public media, there had been a state-backed public media in Hungary that was nominally impartial. Fidesz shifted that entirely. Instead of being a nominally impartial institution, they changed it so that it was explicitly a government propaganda outlet. In the private media, the Hungarian government used its control over, well, I don't want to say control. The Hungarian government was responsible for some degree of advertising revenue in a number of media outlets. And this advertising revenue, these advertising contracts, let's say, were used in order to pressure media outlets to hew to pro-government narratives. Among those media outlets that basically resisted that by trying to find alternatives, many of them were bought out by new owners who were close politically to Viktor Orban, basically a part of his patronage network. And those new owners would then either close those outlets or change their editorial stance to one that was pro-government. So the result is a media that is very pro-government, both in the public and private sectors, a civil society that had been chilled and either crowded out by government initiatives or just outright shut down. And of course, emergency rule, clientelism, and the constitutional changes all kind of speak for themselves. All of that is very explicitly efforts by a government to tip the scales in its favor, specifically the favor of the incumbent. So this is the style of governance that has very much defined the Orban administration over the past 16 years. And as you can see, there's never a point when it explicitly becomes authoritarian. Mm-hmm. They never completely go one-party state. But you can see how they use their power to undermine democratic norms of behavior and institutional norms of behavior, such that opposition parties are severely disadvantaged. So this is the style of government that various pro-democrat forces in Europe, such as they are concerned about when they complain about other populist movements and parties potentially taking power in places like France, Germany, the UK, etc. The concern is that they'll win election and then just stay in power semi-permanently by implementing changes like these. Not an academic concern. They're doing better and better in some places. I actually had in my notes here that the AfD looks set to win a majority in a German state, Anhalt-Saxony, which would be the first time they had done so. If it happens, anyway. So the election in Hungary is definitely a victory for the establishment liberals of Europe. I use that not in the American sense of the term, just to be clear. It has to be restated. There's always people who complain. But yeah, the anti-populist, let's say, faction of European politics won a victory here, but the overarching conflict between them and populists is definitely not over. That's going to be an ongoing drama for some time.
You mentioned the immigration policy of the new party as opposed to Orban's stance. I was asking about that right before you got into it.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. You know, he wants to go hard on asylum seekers, wants to maintain the wall, the actual wall that Orban built back in the day, and in general has a hard line on immigration. He's also pretty pro-family, as I understand, pro-natalist. You know, wants to improve birth rates in Hungary. I don't expect him to be any more successful than anybody else, but that's a popular political position. So prototypical anti-immigration politics, basically. Limits to asylum seekers, maybe even a block. Limits to genuine immigration, especially from, you know, outside the European Union. Also, obviously, immigration from inside the EU is kind of harder to stop. I think Hungary is in the Schengen zone. Status quo ante, in other words. I don't expect anything of substance to change on that count. I don't think you could win an election in Hungary otherwise.
So I guess the big two changes are heck Orban, we agree on that, and the EU is pretty cool. We want to be closer with them.
Yeah. Yeah, they're going to have a relatively more Europhile perspective in foreign policy. How far they go with that, I don't know, because it is still going to be a nominally nationalist government, so there's going to be limits. Maybe more like, what's his name in Czechia? I'm blanking out on his name. He was president in what was then called the Czech Republic back in the 90s. It's going to bug me. Václav Havel, there we go. So Havel was pro-Europe, but he also had a Eurosceptic strain to him. You know, he wanted to integrate it. He wanted Czechia to integrate into Europe, but he wanted there to be limits. He still wanted Czech sovereignty to be respected. So probably more Václav Havel than something that is more genuinely and thoroughly Europhile. Hmm. Was there any other particular item you wanted to get to?
Space mission, Hungary. The other comments I saw were about the blockade, Hormuz stuff.
Yeah, that's definitely on the docket.
Were there any other countries that did notable stuff?
Kind of, not really. I mean, the drama in the world right now is Iran. There's not really escaping that. It's very much the center of foreign policy gravity at the moment. I had some other marginal items, but that's still easily the main thing. Do you know much about Budapest?
It's the capital of Hungary.
Yeah. But like the history, you know, what goes on there, whatnot.
No.
It's a pretty cool city. It's a very sort of, it's very old, obviously, but it's still got a lot of classical stylings to its architecture. Yeah, it's suffered a little bit from the Orban period. It's not economically the most thriving place these days. It's one of the reasons that Fidesz lost support. but it's still relatively happening. I think they do have a nascent tech sector there. Also, random fun trivia, last I checked, it was still the porn capital of Europe. Very much puts it at odds with that image that Fidesz had tried to cultivate of Hungary as a bastion of traditional conservative life in Europe. It very much was not. In fact, I remember a couple of high-ranking Fidesz politicians getting in trouble for cavorting with Hungarian porn stars at one point.
Cavorting?
Cavorting. Interacting with, partying on a boat, as I recall.
Huh. I think I learned a word. I know to consort with, but cavorting with.
Yeah, I think there was another Hungarian politician who was, this is back during the pandemic in 2020. He was caught breaking pandemic rules in the Netherlands because, of course, there were restrictions on group gatherings, and the group gathering that he got caught in was a gay orgy. Yeah, another one of those cases.
And this was a conservative person?
Yeah, Fidesz. This was a Fidesz politician.
Oh.
As I recall, I could be wrong. I welcome correction. But I think it was Fidesz. Got a lot of shit for it. Caught him naked trying to jump out the window to get away. One of the more colorful stories from 2020. Let's see. I guess we can get into Iran then.
Sure.
Have you been following the Iran stuff at all this week?
I think Trump was talking about maybe teaming up with Iran to agree to blockade the Strait of Hormuz.
Close. Not quite. There was no team up.
Yeah, that was a joke.
Oh, sorry. I took that literally. Yeah, that was the talk today, specifically, I think. There were quite a few other twists and turns over the past week. Yeah, so let's see. The big item was the ceasefire. There actually was traction on that, and there was a whole thing. I'll kind of go through it all. Didn't work out. That's the Cliff Notes version of today. There was a ceasefire agreed and implemented, but it was very rocky, and the negotiations that were supposed to progress the ceasefire to a general agreement failed over the weekend. The ceasefire is a 2-week ceasefire, so even though the peace talks failed, the ceasefire will still be in place for another week. But for now, anyway, there's not going to be a general agreement. So presumably hostilities will resume after the next week, unless they can extend the ceasefire further or otherwise make progress in peace talks. We shall see. So that's the sort of God's eye view of the past week, the general summary. Everything else is going to be sort of background and details around that. All right, let me get a drink of water before we go through all this.
Take your time, Sam.
Okay. So just before we get to the ceasefire, just a couple marginal items here. The buildup of U.S. troops in the Middle East has actually continued, so a ground incursion is not off the table. The U.S. now has over 50,000 troops deployed in the Middle East, and the number is still increasing. So 50,000 and more is better than what there was before, at least as far as the credibility of a potential ground incursion, certainly a potential invasion. But even if they get up to 100,000 or 200,000, which is, I don't even know if 200,000 is even realistically possible. But even that would not be enough for a full invasion. Like, a limited incursion is their best case scenario. So I still see this as posturing and possible preparation for maybe taking an island like Karg Island or Larik Island or one of the other islands in the Persian Gulf. But I don't think there's really much room for more than that. Let's see, as far as airstrikes, the target set apparently also includes and included railroads. This is something the Israeli government was talking about recently. They were talking about attacking railways and bridges that were being used by the IRGC for logistical reasons of one kind or another. So they had talked about hitting missile sites, warehouses, inventories, etc. But that was the first time I'd seen them say that they were actually hitting railroads, generally speaking. So that'll be another thing that Iran has to rebuild, after the conflict ends. The U.S. also hit Karg Island. I think this was in the lead up to the ceasefire talks. So you can consider this the Trump administration putting pressure on the Iranians to kind of come to the table. They did not hit any of the energy infrastructure. The targets they hit on the island were bunkers, radar stations, ammunition storage, etc. Again, the broader civilian infrastructure was left intact. Let's see, and rail lines, etc., etc. Okay. So that brings us to the ceasefire negotiations. So the lead up included a lot of posturing by the different parties involved. For those who don't know, these talks were mediated by the Pakistani government. And the Pakistanis actually did some posturing of their own. The Pakistani army actually warned that Iran's continued hostility towards Saudi Arabia could close the door to mediation. The Pakistanis have a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. The exact terms of that are a little unclear to me. I don't think it has an actual mutual defense clause in it. But there is nominally a commitment for Pakistan to at least help Saudi Arabia to some degree if it comes under attack. That's not the same thing as mutual defense. Mutual defense is more ironclad. This is more amorphous. So the Pakistanis were trying to pressure the Iranians here into coming to the table. The Iranians, for their part, did some posturing as well. They announced that they had stopped ceasefire negotiations with the United States at one point and told the Pakistanis that they would no longer participate in talks. And for the US's part, the Trump administration did some posturing of its own in prototypical Trump style. They were making noise about potentially using nuclear weapons against Iran. This was nothing official. This came in the form of various leaks from the Trump administration to the press that the president was considering nuclear weapons, or at least was thinking about it. And I don't think those leaks were accidental. I suspect those were deliberate on the part of the Trump administration to pressure the Iranians to come to the table again. I could be wrong. I can't prove it, but those seem like strategic leaks to me. But that didn't stop the internet from going into a tizzy about it. Mm-hmm. There was quite a bit of hand-wringing about it.
That almost adds to the legitimacy of your intention if you at least disguise it as a leak. Because if you just make a statement, then obviously you want to keep a lot of the cards close to your vest when you're making statements. You want to over-disclose your strategy. So if you act like it's a leak, then people are more likely to suspect that maybe it's real information.
Yeah, there is some truth to that. Strategic leaks do have a long history in Washington. But I think part of the calculus here also was that they were a little, perhaps, concerned about the implications of just making full-on nuclear threats. Mm-hmm. That's not really a norm that you want in international relations. So even the Trump administration has been kind of gun-shy about going that far. Mm-hmm. Although, again, in prototypical Trumpian style, they have not apparently been afraid to hint at it, which I would point out still breaks the norm. That's still not really acceptable behavior. But I suspect in their minds, they're kind of respecting the norm still. even by approaching it in this direction. The Israelis, for their part, are not really entirely happy about the ceasefire negotiations, and they expressed some resistance to the progression of the talks in the lead up to the ceasefire agreement. The Israeli government's position is that it would be premature, and that they, for their part, expected operations to continue unimpeded for at least another month. So they were not really entirely on board with the whole ceasefire process. And that's just one bit of evidence among multiple that there may be some daylight between the American and Israeli governments on the whole Iran operation, not even just the peace talks. So, as you might expect, the first 2 days of the ceasefire, which was eventually agreed, they agreed to it, I think, an hour before Trump's Tuesday deadline, which I think was 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And there was nominal agreement on the terms, but then it became very apparent very quickly that the terms were a little bit ambiguous. And there was a lot of sniping back and forth between the Iranian government and the American government about who was breaching the terms of the ceasefire and what exactly the terms were, etc. The nominal outline of the agreement, as it was announced on the first day, is that the U.S. and Israel would stop attacking Iran, and the Iranians, in turn, would stop firing missiles and drones at both the U.S. targets and also at targets within U.S. allies in the region. The ceasefire was slated, and nominally still is, set to last 2 weeks, during which time there would be nominal negotiations for some kind of final peace agreement. The Iranians, under the agreement, were also supposed to open the Strait of Hormuz. So that was the outline announced on the first day, but there were clearly ambiguities. For one, Israel on the first day said that the deal did not cover Lebanon, but the Pakistani government, which again was acting as mediators, said that it did. Iranian and Israeli operations actually continued in the aftermath of the announcement, despite the fact that it was supposed to go into effect immediately, which led to some concerns that maybe it wasn't actually happening at all. There was some confusion on that count. And the Iranian government said that the deal included U.S. reparations, and the U.S. government, as you might expect, said that no, it did not. And Trump said that Iranian uranium enrichment would be fully addressed in the deal, but Iran said that the deal would allow them to continue enriching uranium. So lots of disagreements here about just what exactly was agreed to. I would point out that Trump only ever said that the Iranian proposal that was accepted as part of the ceasefire agreement was only ever a framework for negotiations. He never formally accepted the 10-point Iranian proposal. So it's not really the case that the Trump administration just, quote unquote, gave them what they wanted in exchange for a ceasefire. They basically, near as I can tell, just agreed to a ceasefire and then also said that the other side nominally agreed to their respective proposals. The Trump administration says that it accepted the Iranian proposal, but clearly they didn't. It's just a framework, and the Iranian government made similarly bombastic statements. The real agreement, near as I can tell, is just a ceasefire for 2 weeks and then nominal negotiations in between. Opening the Strait of Hormuz may or may not have been a part of the original agreement. Regardless, it hasn't happened. The Iranians, for their part, say that the reason that they have not opened the strait is because they believed Lebanon was part of the ceasefire, and the Israelis have just gone apeshit on Lebanon. Basically, with the start of the ceasefire, they actually launched an air offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon, roughly at the same time that the ceasefire was announced. I don't think that was deliberate. I think they were already planning to do that. Israel has been escalating in Lebanon for the past week and change. But the timing was not great as far as how it looks. So those were the ambiguities in the agreement. Even if Israeli operations have continued against Hezbollah, and even if Iran has refused to open the Strait of Hormuz, the ceasefire has actually held. It did take like a day and change for the Iranians to stop firing at targets and GCC nations, but they eventually did. And Israel and the United States have ceased operations in Iran. So for the moment, there is nominal quiet within Iran itself. Not Lebanon, but Iran at least. Okay, so that brings us to the negotiations. Yeah, we talked about all of that. Oh, there was some question about whether or not the Israelis outright opposed the ceasefire negotiations and the subsequent ceasefire agreement. Netanyahu saw fit to release a statement saying that the ceasefire agreement was reached, quote, in full cooperation, unquote, with Israel, and that Israel was not notified at the last minute, or something to that effect. It was also noted by the Israeli government that the temporary, like I said, the Israeli government insists that Lebanon is not covered by the ceasefire agreement. So the Israeli government here is stating that they were in full cooperation, basically, with the United States in terms of the ceasefire talks. I think the fact that he had to release the statement kind of discounts that a little bit. And their previous aforementioned opposition to the ceasefire talks does kind of suggest that they may not entirely be getting their way here, or may not entirely be in the loop. I don't doubt that the US government is at least consulting them. But it may be that the progression of the talks has very much happened in opposition to the Israeli government's preferences. Let's see. Another note I have here about some of the internal politics of Iran vis-a-vis the ceasefire talks. Apparently, the IRGC was very reluctant to accede to this, and it fell to civilian leadership to kind of push it through. Apparently, not only that, but civilian leadership had actually agreed to a temporary ceasefire in exchange for opening the Strait of Hormuz-style deal several days before the agreement actually happened. And the reason it didn't happen sooner is because they apparently faced an immense amount of resistance and pushback from the IRGC. And it took several days to overcome that. It's possible elements within the IRGC actually may have tried to sabotage the ceasefire agreement after it was announced. It was noted that in the hours after the agreement was announced, there was an Iranian drone attack targeting a Saudi petrochemical hub. And that was considered by the Pakistanis to be, quote, a last-ditch move to derail talks, unquote. Now, I haven't really seen any other evidence that it was specifically the IRGC trying to sabotage the talks, or maybe elements within the IRGC trying to unilaterally sabotage the talks. But it's worth mentioning here that the IRGC was not entirely unified on this, and that the Iranian government as a whole definitely was not. There is some daylight between the civilian leadership and the IRGC on that count. I don't think that necessarily matters too much, because the IRGC is very much in the driver's seat. If there's any hope of, say, broader progress in peace talks, certainly in terms of broader regime change in Iran, there would have to be significant defections from the IRGC itself. A break between the IRGC and the civilian leadership is not going to be sufficient. Let's see. So on Lebanon, there was a lot of jockeying in the days after the ceasefire about the status of Lebanon, whether or not it was covered or not. One interesting item that came up that was reported by CBS, apparently Trump originally believed that Lebanon would be covered by the ceasefire. However, he apparently changed his mind later on after discussing the matter with the Israeli government. Now, CBS is the only outlet that's reported this, but if it's true, it's notable because it indicates that it's evidence that the Israeli government in Washington are actually coordinating closely on the ceasefire. But the fact that Trump initially believed it did cover Lebanon does kind of suggest that the Trump administration maybe did not really consult the Israeli government that closely in the initial talks and only came to the Israelis after.
Why would there be confusion about Lebanon?
The Iranian government insists that the ceasefire should encompass not only Iran, but also its allied proxy militias in the region, including Hezbollah.
Oh.
They were very explicit about that, and if the CBS report is accurate, then the Trump administration itself was of the same mind, that the ceasefire agreement did encompass Lebanon. The Israelis ignored that, attacked Lebanon anyway, and apparently were successful in convincing the Trump administration that the ceasefire did not encompass Lebanon. So Israeli operations there have continued, even as they have stopped in Iran itself. So all of this talk is just basically about how closely tied the Trump administration and the Israeli government are on the ongoing operations in the region. There's evidence both ways at this point. I kind of suspect the Trump administration is just acting unilaterally, which is pretty much what it always does, and then just kind of consults Israel after the fact. That would be within precedent for the Trump administration. I don't know that Israel is going to be too bothered by that like they would normally, because, as I mentioned, they've been pretty successful in changing the administration's mind, or at least the president's mind, if they do something they don't want. So this isn't too big a problem at the moment. But it's maybe probable even that eventually the Trump administration will do something they explicitly do not like and cannot be talked out of. That could be interesting if and when it happens. But I think we're a ways off from that for the moment. Okay, Strait of Hormuz, as mentioned, because of the Lebanon imbroglio, the Strait of Hormuz has remained closed in contravention to the agreement that had been made Tuesday. That is this past Tuesday. And not only that, but Iran has moved forward with trying to exact tolls on ships that want to pass through the strait. And apparently there's been some progress on that count as far as actually drawing up the regime that would be necessary to do it. And some ships have already paid tolls, from what I was reading. Apparently they are required, that is to say the ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz are required to pay these tolls in either cryptocurrency or Chinese yuan.
It doesn't matter which coin?
Not specified. I'm sure they have their preference. It could be that they're willing to accept multiple different types, depending on what's most accessible for the ship owner in question. It was noted that Iran was allowing relatively more ships through the strait, but I suspect that pretty much all of them did so with explicit permission from the Iranian government, and also probably paid tolls, and also were probably destined for Iranian ports. I haven't seen any evidence yet that any ships have been allowed through that were destined for GCC ports. So there's been no change in the Iranian position on that count since the conflict started. There was also some weird destroyer drama within the past, couple days. Apparently a U.S. destroyer was noted by the Iranians to be heading away from an Emirati port east of the Strait of Hormuz, towards the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians told the Pakistani mediator that if that destroyer continued through to the strait, then it would be targeted within 30 minutes, supposedly. A U.S. official later came out and said that the ship actually did cross the Strait of Hormuz from east to west to the Gulf and then came back through the strait. The U.S. official quoted on this said, quote, "This was an operation that focused on freedom of navigation through the international waterways," unquote. This is the first time that a U.S. warship has crossed the Strait of Hormuz since the conflict began. I haven't seen any other details about this. The Iranians did not end up attacking the ship, and so nothing seems to have come of it. I guess you could consider this a flex by the U.S. Navy if they did indeed successfully navigate the strait with a warship, but I noted it was only one destroyer, and I find it a little weird that it didn't go through to a port on the other side of the strait. So I kind of wonder if they didn't go through the strait and then just immediately turn around. Maybe even they didn't go that far into the strait, which maybe is why the Iranians didn't attack it. I don't know. The whole story is very bizarre to me. I guess it's not really beyond the Trump administration to do something just to flex on a counterparty. But I would have thought the Iranian government would have taken the opportunity to show them they mean business as far as closing the strait. So it could be they wanted to refrain from attacking the destroyer as a kind of concession to show good faith in the negotiations, or maybe they were just worried about potential escalation, or maybe they were just never serious about the threat in the first place. Again, not really sure how to interpret the signaling there. Maybe it just was a freedom of navigation operation by the USN, but the fact that they just kind of tipped their toe in the water and then ran away kind of undermines that. I think there would need to be a more committed freedom of navigation operation to really have the desired effect. That's how the US does it over in the South China Sea, in the maritime waters that are claimed by China, but are not recognized as Chinese by other governments. Generally, those kinds of freedom of navigation operations involve whole carrier battle groups. They don't just send in one small ship and just go a mile into the disputed territory and then leave. That's weird behavior. Mm-hmm. So let's see, the talks eventually did begin. This is the peace talks that were announced as part of the ceasefire agreement. The talks happened in Islamabad, again, Pakistan mediating. The respective positions of the Iranian and US governments were not entirely clear. Obviously, both of them are kind of cagey, opaque governments at this point. From what I was able to glean, the respective positions were as follows. The Iranian government wanted a release of assets held abroad. These are financial assets. They demanded control of the Strait of Hormuz, including the right to collect tolls as transit fees, payment of war reparations, a ceasefire encompassing the entire region. Again, they want Lebanon to be covered. The US position kind of vacillated over time. The Trump administration is famously averse to having concrete asks in negotiations, rather. Among the requests that we know about, they wanted free passage for global shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, they did not want the strait to be either controlled or tolled by the Iranian government. And they also wanted Iran's nuclear enrichment program to be significantly curtailed, if not outright ended. Basically, they want to ensure that Iran can never produce an atomic bomb. That is nominally the main, or at least a long-term objective of the US government. And I didn't read anything to this effect, but given past precedent, I suspect the US government would have also been asking for the curtailing of Iran's ballistic missile program and then also proxy militias in the region. So that's my best guess at the outline of the respective positions of the parties involved in the Islamabad talks. So as the negotiations progressed, one thing I read from Amwaj, which is a regional media outlet, apparently Iran has softened its position on its nuclear program over time. There's still a lot of distance between the US and Iranian positions, but apparently the Iranian government has become more amenable to diluting and accepting limits on its stockpile of uranium. So that is a potential point of concession that the Iranians would be willing to make in exchange for something else. There was also an announcement by the Iranian government that the US had agreed to release frozen Iranian assets, which, as I mentioned, was one of the things they were looking for. But then a US official denied that was true. So how you read that depends on who you think is more trustworthy, the Iranian government or the Trump administration. It could be the Iranians are bullshitting here, but it could be the case that the Trump administration did release a limited subset of frozen Iranian assets as a show of good faith in the negotiations. The assets in question are actually the same assets that have kind of been bandied around by different administrations at this point. The funds in question actually stemmed from from a sale of Iranian oil to South Korea that was frozen originally back in the first term of the Trump administration back in 2018 as a result of the reimposition of U.S. sanctions after Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal with Iran. The South Korean government, in turn, interred those funds in recognition of the reimposed U.S. sanctions. It's about $6 billion, and it had been due for release in 2023 as part of a U.S.-Iranian prisoner swap that was negotiated by the Biden administration. But then the funds were frozen again as a result of Hamas's attack on Israel in October 23. So these funds have kind of gone back and forth in negotiations with Iran for some years now. And once again, they've become part of a negotiation process.
As soon as you stop being naughty, we'll give you $6 billion. That's funny.
That's the gist of it.
6 billion. Just hold on to it.
Yeah, there's much more money than that much more Iranian money than that's being frozen, but that particular item came up in different talks, and so that's what they've kind of fixated on. Let's see. So later on, it was announced that the United States and Iran had reached a stalemate in the talks, specifically over control of the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. government was apparently particularly reluctant to concede that Iranian demand. And then the next day, after that was announced, there was an announcement from the U.S. government that the talks had just outright failed. The negotiations had apparently gone for 21 hours in Islamabad, and eventually they just had to announce that there was no progress and that it wasn't going anywhere. So I had a list of determinants of the failure, at least as they've been announced thus far, from the respective parties involved. Vice President Vance was actually the lead negotiator for the United States. Make of that what you will. The Iranians had already announced before that they would not accept Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner as negotiating counterparties. They considered them illegitimate because when they were talking with them in a previous negotiation, the Trump administration attacked. That was the prelude to the current conflict. So Vance was tapped as a replacement, or maybe a complement, since Witkoff and Kushner are still kind of on the sidelines. And Vance announced after the end of the talks that, quote, Iran chose not to accept our terms, unquote. It's a very politically correct way of saying that the talks failed, but make of that what you will.
It was their fault that they failed.
Yeah. And the U.S. needs to see a, quote, fundamental commitment from Tehran not to develop nuclear weapons, unquote. So the U.S. position, apparently, on nuclear weapons was a point of contention for Iran. He also elaborated on the nuclear question. He said that halting the country from having a nuclear weapon, both now and in the future, is U.S. President Donald Trump's core goal. That's another quote. And let's see, he also Trump himself added that the talks failed because, quote, Iran is unwilling to give up its nuclear ambitions, unquote. So the U.S. position here seems to be that the talks failed because of recalcitrance from the Iranian government on the nuclear question. So if we combine that with the statement before about control over the Strait of Hormuz, it seems that the points that the Iranians were the most reluctant to concede ground on were the nuclear program on the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian government, for its part, has a different perspective on the failure of the talks. Iran's foreign ministry said the talks were intensive and called on Washington to refrain from quote, excessive demands and unlawful requests, unquote. The leader of Iran's delegation also said that the U.S. failed to gain Tehran's trust during the negotiations. And the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, said on Twitter, bizarrely, quote, when just inches away from Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, we encountered maximalism, shifting goalposts, and a blockade. Goodwill begets goodwill, enmity begets enmity, unquote. So my reading on that is that this suggests that the Trump administration may be seeking Venezuela-style arrangements with the Iranian government. I have some more evidence in the form of a Trump tweet, I think from today or yesterday, in which he was saying that the conflict would end with a Venezuela-style arrangement with Iran. So combining that with the Iranian statements here, I suspect that the Trump administration was making maximalist demands about things like leadership of the Iranian government, as well as potentially control over the sale of Iranian oil and American control over the dispersing of funds derived from the sale of Iranian oil, as is the case with Venezuela at the moment. So taking all of that in aggregate, the Iranians were not willing to give ground on control over Strait of Hormuz. They're demanding it. The American government is not willing to give ground on the nuclear deal. They're demanding significant changes there, or even the end of the program outright, including potentially even just civilian usage, which would entail reducing enrichment, reducing the ability to enrich entirely. And then the Iranians, for their part, are just dead set opposed to conceding any sovereignty to the US government. If it's true that the Trump administration is asking for input on leadership in Iran and control over Iranian oil, all of that is going to be beyond the pale for nationalists in Iran. So those, and this is speculation on my part, just trying to glean information from statements here, those seem to be the sticking points in the negotiation thus far. That's my best guess, given what I've heard and read. So what's the outlook on the talks as of now? Trump is bullish. He said that, quote, "It makes no difference to him whether a deal is reached. Regardless what happens, we win," unquote. He also added that U.S. negotiators got, quote, "just about every point we needed except for the fact that they refused to give up their nuclear ambition," unquote. He said that it was the Iranians who left the bargaining table, and he added, quote, "I predict they come back and they give us everything we want," unquote. That was from an interview on Fox News, apparently. Iran, for its part, specifically the president of Iran, says a deal with the U.S. is not out of reach if the Trump administration abides by international law. And it was also noted today that there are apparently attempts to extend the ceasefire for another 2 weeks. So that would extend its total length to a month. So it seems like overall, there's not a lot that's actually changed in terms of the respective positions of the parties involved. So I'm not really sure what the ceasefire is meant to accomplish, other than to potentially act as an off-ramp in the long term. So it could just be that the ceasefire is cheap theatrics for the US government, since the Trump administration really wasn't banking, from what I've gathered, that the conflict would last more than a week. For the Iranians, it's just a respite. They get a kind of break here in which they can recover, get some breathing room, and prep for a potential resumption of hostilities, which is entirely possible. I don't think the Iranian government is interested in giving big concessions, in spite of the fact that they have very little leverage. So a resumption of hostilities, I would think, at this point anyway, is the most likely outcome. I would discount that a little bit if they are actually successful in extending the ceasefire for another 2 weeks. That would suggest to me that they've more or less agreed that the conflict is over and are just looking for some kind of face-saving settlement in which they can both kind of claim meets all of their demands to a domestic political audience. Working out the details of that particular expression of kayfabe will probably take some time, given how far apart the US and Iranian governments are. But an extension of the ceasefire agreement suggests to me that that's more what they're angling for. But we'll see. This is all, again, speculation on my part. I'm just having to do the best I can with limited information. So we'll see how things shake out in practice.
I have a military question. For someone who's blockading a waterway like the Strait of Hormuz, if you have air dominance with like planes and stuff, can you not just destroy the boats that are doing the blockade? Or is it mines that are the problem?
It depends on the kind of blockade. If you're actually blockading with naval assets like ships, then yeah, you could use air power to force them out. But there are many ways to blockade a strait. I would point out that Iran is effectively blockading the Strait of Hormuz right now. And they're doing so with very limited resources, basically just the threat, the possibility of a drone strike, or even just the threat of hitting a mine is sufficient to de facto blockade the Strait of Hormuz. So you don't actually need ships to do that. It's enough just to project power into the strait.
Yeah, chat's saying that they just have people along the coastline, so you don't necessarily need water control. You just have coast control, which that's harder for aircraft to deal with, especially if you have, like, they were saying individuals with rocket launchers is another like way to threaten boats. And if it's civilian boats passing through, they're not going to be as heavily armored and able to defend themselves as military boats. So I guess I was visualizing it wrong. It's not boat versus boat in the Strait of Hormuz with planes overhead. It's shipping vessels trying to pass through and people shooting at those.
Yeah, merchant vessels are going to be much more risk averse than, say, a Navy ship for the U.S. Navy.
Mm-hmm.
But even with the U.S. Navy, they're relatively risk averse when it comes to sea mines. We kind of talked about that last time. Apparently, they're much more concerned about the sea mines than they are virtually any other threat. Like, even the sea drones are not that big a deal for them. You know, they have enough air defenses on individual ships and certainly in larger task forces to be able to reliably shoot down incoming drones, possibly even a drone swarm if one is fired at them. But sea mines, on the other hand, are a bigger problem. The mine sweeping capacity of the U.S. Navy has eroded over time. And I was actually wondering over the past week if that isn't maybe a big reason why the Trump administration is bitching at the Europeans to help more. The Europeans do have still some residual minesweeping capacity that they could lend. And it may be that the U.S. government feels that's necessary in lieu of their own inadequacies in that area. But I think the U.S. Navy does still have enough minesweeping capacity for the strait by itself, so I don't know how accurate a read that is. I guess we'll find out one way or the other. But yeah, the U.S. Navy is mostly worried about sea mines. That's the biggest problem, and that is enough just by itself to blockade the strait. You don't actually need vessels in there to do that. And I would point out that the U.S. could do this too. Like, we don't actually have to send the U.S. Navy in to blockade the strait. We can just have the U.S. Navy arrayed outside the strait and enforcing a de facto blockade from that position. You know, they can detect incoming cargo ships and see who's moving where. So if anybody tries to make a break for the strait after making a deal with Iran, they can be intercepted or even outright destroyed.
Didn't you say that they use dolphins to try to minesweep in the past?
Dolphins have been trained in the past to do so. I don't know how effective that means of minesweeping ever was, but it has been attempted both in the United States and in Russia.
All right, look, Mr. Dolphin, I'm going to send you on a very dangerous mission, but if you succeed, you're going to get the most gourmet fish the world has ever known, and a lot of it. Yeah, dolphin minesweepers and war eagles, militarized locusts. Aren't drones just like locust swarms anyway?
To a degree. You could kind of think of them like that. I guess we need robot ducks to deal with them then.
Yep. Already seeing a great animated film in the works.
Let's see. One thing I read today actually involved a proposal from a former Iranian foreign minister that was apparently published within Iranian media. And I don't know how representative this is of sentiment within Iranian politics. This guy is more of a reformist in orientation, so he's not really representative of like the pro-IRGC element within Iranian politics. But the nature of the proposal that he published within Iranian media is notable. It calls for a peace agreement with the United States, basically an end to the fighting. And the details of the proposal are as follows. He called for the Iranian government to give nuclear concessions and to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, in exchange asking for a full lifting of sanctions from the United States. The details are as follows. He called on Tehran to cap uranium enrichment below 3.67%. So they would still be able to enrich uranium in general, but they would be agreeing here not to do it anything above what would be necessary for civilian usages. Furthermore, he wants Iran to promise to blend down existing stockpiles of nuclear material that already have been enriched to a degree that might be applicable to military uses. Let's see, transfer enriched uranium to a new multilateral consortium. This item has kind of been a talking point in previous negotiations between the Obama, Trump, Biden administrations. The idea here is that the US, if not the broader world, since the world was kind of part of the nuclear negotiations in previous iterations of the negotiations, the idea is that they wanted Iran to give up existing stockpiles and that the way to do it is to not to have them get rid of them unilaterally, rather to ensure the process was done credibly. They wanted them to hand over those nuclear materials to some third party who could account for them and dispose of them under the eye of both Iranian and American observers. So basically, under the proposal here, they would be conceding to that. And then also they would accept full ratification of the additional protocol, which I think is part of a previous iteration of the nuclear negotiations. Let's see, as far as the Strait of Hormuz, as I said, Iran would agree to reopen the strait, and then the US would be expected in return to end all sanctions, finance reconstruction, and then agree to a permanent mutual non-aggression pact, a particularly notable item. So, as you might expect, nationalists in Iran condemned this proposal utterly and asked for him to be prosecuted. They really hated this proposal. But given, as I mentioned earlier, that people are kind of watching for cleavages within the establishment within Iran, this is a sign of that. It's a very limited sign because, as I mentioned, there is a reformist element within the Islamist government in Iran, and they've always been relatively dovish in how they want to deal with the nuclear issue and the broader world. So this is kind of them just being themselves, but the fact that they actually came out and proposed this publicly is an indication that there may at least be some discussion happening about this behind closed doors. That's the interpretation I read anyway from Amouage. So I don't think this necessarily augurs in a collapse of the regime or anything that dramatic. But I think it does suggest that maybe the IRGC and hardliners in the Iranian government may be more willing to make concessions than they've let on thus far. Don't read too much into it. These reformists are very unpopular with the establishment. So there's a cap to how much traction they can get with stuff like this. But they would not, as I understand it, as I read, be able to propose this publicly without fear of significant pushback unless there was at least some consideration of the proposal already happening within some elements of the hardline establishment. Okay, and that brings us to the post-collapse news, which regards the Strait of Hormuz. And as Chad has already pointed out, this involves President Donald Trump saying that the U.S. Navy will blockade any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. This is probably an exaggeration. The U.S. military came out after the fact and said that it is going to blockade Iranian ports starting Monday, and that CENTCOM forces will not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. So I think this is the actual plan here. And I think Trump was kind of overstating his position by saying that the U.S. Navy would be blockading the Strait of Hormuz entirely, because that implies that even allied ships would not be allowed to cross. So the U.S. military, I think, is announcing in more detail what was actually meant by that, or at least what they're actually going to do, which is that they're going to end the de facto exemption that they had been granting to Iranian ships. You know, before They had nominally been sanctioned and were, at least you would expect under the conditions of a conflict, would not be allowed to actually transit Iranian oil out of the Persian Gulf. But instead, they'd actually been allowing them to continue to do that, even though Iran was shutting down the strait and not allowing tankers that were carrying oil from American allies to transit the strait. So that was a bizarre sort of accidental point of agreement between Washington and Tehran. They both kind of implicitly agreed that ships carrying Iranian oil would be allowed to continue using the Strait of Hormuz. So this new plan is basically just to end that. Now Iranian ships carrying Iranian oil will not be able to transit the Strait of Hormuz. The American position was always that ships carrying the oil from allied states could do so, but the Iranians obviously were not allowing that. So this is going to be a more complete shutdown of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. But it's not a full blockade, as Trump himself indicated that it was earlier on. This is basically just ending the Iranian de facto exemption that they had had in place before, which probably should not have been in place before. It still kind of boggles my mind that they did that. Being in a de facto war with Iran and allowing them to continue selling oil, like, very, very bizarre logic.
We're at war with you, but we're going to let you work normally.
Yeah. Yeah, nominally I think the rationale was that they wanted to try to mitigate damage to oil markets, to try to prevent oil prices from going up, but if that was the actual rationale, that's stupid. The effect of sanctions over the past 10 years has been that oil production in Iran has troughed considerably. And it's not nearly as important a producer to global oil markets as it used to be. They are still a significant producer, but they're not moving global oil prices like they used to. So if they're hoping to mitigate the impact on oil prices, then that was a dumb thing to do from the start. Regardless, they're changing it now. And it's not going to really change too much here, but it will result in less oil revenue for the Iranian government during the conflict itself, which could apply additional pressure. Okay, so that's the main body of the Iran update. So some of the other stuff here is just sort of international diplomacy and some other items. On the economic impact of the conflict, we've talked about some of the items that have seen price spikes and other disruptions on account of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Individual markets that have been the most effective thus far include oil, natural gas, fertilizer, aluminum, helium, and one additional one I wanted to talk about that I was reading about more recently was naphtha, which I'm almost certainly mispronouncing. So this is a core ingredient for plastic production, and apparently it's produced itself as a byproduct of refining, I guess, oil. And apparently Middle Eastern oil producers are among the world's leading producers of naphtha. And correspondingly, as a result of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, there has been a significant disruption in the supply chains for global plastics producers in different countries. I imagine they have some inventory to last them a while, but the prices are still going up, correspondent with the curtailing of the supply. So one of the knock-on effects of the conflict could be more expensive plastic products or products that involve inputs that are themselves plastic products. Okay, so the international side of the conflict. Trump has threatened 50% tariffs on any country that sells arms to Iran. That was reiterated in the past week. Let's see, the Emiratis have actually attacked Iran. Apparently, they launched an airstrike attacking a refinery on Lavon Island in the Persian Gulf. So this is the first time, as far as I know, that Emirati armed forces have actually participated in the strikes on Iran. Obviously, this predated the ceasefire agreement. I think the fact that this was underreported and is just basically one airstrike in isolate indicates how little Emirati participation in the campaign really matters. There's just a hard limit to how many resources they can actually commit or really even have on offer. So this was never going to be a dramatic step up, at least as far as the operational tempo of the overarching operations. But for what it's worth, the Emiratis have actually participated, and that does represent a degree of escalation on their part. It's also further evidence that they're one of, if not the most hawkish of the GCC nations vis-a-vis the Iran issue. I don't think any of the others have actually gone to the length of actually striking targets within Iran. Let's see, Kurds. I read an article arguing that part of the reason the Kurds had not actually invaded Iran or otherwise engaged in operations designed to violently subvert the Iranian government is that they were deterred from doing so by the Iranian government itself. Apparently, they attacked Kurdish forces in Iraq with a range of drones and ballistic missiles. And I had already known that. I think we've talked about it before. But the argumentation here is that the effect of that bombardment was to at least contribute to the deterring of Kurdish militias in Iraq from taking any action in Iran. Let's see, Pakistan, for its part, is escalating its military presence in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been attacked by Iran in retaliation for the Israeli-American operations against it. The Saudis have invoked their defense treaty with the Pakistanis and are asking them to, quote-unquote, do something. And the Pakistanis have responded to that to varying degrees, but to a degree that is escalating. Let's see, after Iran hit a petrochemical complex in Saudi Arabia, a Saudi-Pakistani official told Reuters that the attack could draw Pakistan into the conflict as per its defense pact with Saudi Arabia. Let's see, a couple days later, a Pakistani Air Force IL-78 tanker, apparently, an IL-78 MP tanker and transport aircraft flew to Saudi Arabia. It did not land, apparently, but instead remained active in the air over the eastern region over Bahrain, presumably providing support to fighter jets. And then a couple days after that, it was announced that a Pakistani military contingent of 13,000 soldiers, as well as 10 to 18 Pakistani aircraft, had made it to Saudi Arabia. So you can see an escalating Pakistani military presence in Saudi Arabia. I would point out as a side note here that the 13,000 soldiers that were sent to Saudi Arabia were not actually infantrymen. They were almost entirely, from what I read, either airmen or technical personnel of one kind or another. So Pakistan has an air element in Saudi Arabia, but it's not that significant. 10 to 18 jets is not all that much in the grand scheme of things. So my reading on this for now is that this is a symbolic deployment that is designed to reassure the Saudis that the Pakistanis are willing to honor their defense agreement, but does not represent a significant military commitment to actually take action to defend Saudi Arabia offensively. These troops could be designed to provide to engage in defensive operations. So, for example, helping shoot down Iranian drones or potentially ballistic missiles, although I don't think they've deployed anything that can do that. So I would infer this is mostly about drones and then also just diplomacy, reassurance. I don't know that they're going to do much beyond that, although we'll see. I would point out also that if Pakistan does want to help Saudi Arabia by attacking Iran, it does not need troops in Saudi Arabia itself to do that. Pakistan and Iran share a border. So if Pakistan wants to do something to pressure Iran, it can just do something along its border. There's no need to send some kind of expeditionary force to Saudi Arabia, and then in turn have them project force into Iran from Saudi Arabia. And as far as I know, there's no Pakistani military buildup or other activity happening along its border with Iran. So I count that as further evidence that the Pakistani force deployed to Saudi Arabia is more of a reassurance force than it is a force that's destined for any kind of military activity. Okay, getting to Europe here. President Macron in France announced the release of 2 French citizens who had been detained by the Iranians for 3.5 years. So that in itself is not related to the conflict, but I'm kind of suspicious that it might be part and parcel of a French government initiative to try to open Iran to talks and to come to some kind of bilateral arrangement vis-a-vis French shipping, and then also possibly to try to push the Iranians into opening the strait and to coming to some kind of conciliatory agreement with the United States. It's possible this effort is happening in conjunction and cooperation with the US and Israel, but the French kind of have a track record of doing things like this on their own. So if I'm right here, and this is part of some kind of behind the door talks between Paris and Tehran, then this could be a result of that. This could be an example of the Iranian government trying to show good faith in negotiations by giving the French something to get the talks started. Pure speculation on my part. That's just an early reading there. Let's see, on NATO, Trump met the Secretary of NATO, Mr. Rutte. I keep forgetting how to pronounce his name. I always want to call him Rutt, but that's not correct, apparently. Let's see. So the Secretary of NATO made the case that even though many NATO members had not given in to Trump's demands to participate in the operation against Iran, a number of them had still facilitated American operations by allowing use of American bases in their territory and otherwise allowing them to go unencumbered. Spain did disallow American usage of American bases in Spain vis-a-vis operations in Iran, but most other NATO states actually did. And even those states that curbed American operations to varying degrees still allowed them to occur in general, just with some caveats. So it's not the case that the United States is getting nothing out of bases in Europe, or NATO for that matter. This was the argumentation made by the Secretary anyway. Now, later on, Trump set a deadline for European allies to provide concrete military support, specifically minesweepers, which is what he's been harping on the most. And the Secretary General of NATO made the point that the political pledges made by NATO members up to that point would no longer be sufficient. So the response, according to Trump anyway, is that NATO apparently has offered to help, quote unquote, clean out the Strait of Hormuz with mine layers, and he made various other statements to that effect. He went on to say that while he was disappointed with NATO, he said they now want to come and they want to help with the strait. And he also said the UK in particular had promised to provide some minesweepers. Let's see. And he also later on has added, quote, "It won't take long to clean it out. So we're going to clean out the strait," unquote. And he also said that he thinks he will be free to use, that the strait will be free to use again in not too long a distance, unquote. I think he means not too long into the future, but it's Trump speak. So the gist of it here is that he talked with the Secretary of NATO, bitched and whined about the lack of European support. The counter-argument is that Europeans were actually still supporting it, albeit implicitly in most cases. And Trump responded to that by reiterating his demand for minesweepers. Allegedly, according to Trump, they have agreed to do that, although I've noted that there seems to be an absence of statements from European states to that effect. So this could be another example of kayfabe, where Europe pretends to be weak and submissive in the face of Trumpian pressure without actually promising to do anything conciliatory. We'll see if there's actually any European minesweepers on their way to the Strait of Hormuz, rather, in the coming week. But for now, at least, the Trump administration, or at least Trump himself, seems to have been placated on this. Let's see. Okay, so that's Europe, and then there's China. Let's see. I read an article in the Financial Times arguing that Iran originally had hoped for more support from China, and that it was disappointed in the lack of support emerging in that regard. But apparently the reason Beijing was reluctant to do so was because Beijing has ties that are as strong with Iran's enemies in the region as it does with Iran. Iran is not like some special ally in the region that Beijing goes out of its way to cultivate ties to. Beijing tries to cultivate ties with every country in the region. And if helping Iran in its war with the United States would sabotage relations with other major countries in the region, it's not really willing to do that. That's a bad trade-off from the perspective of Beijing.
Yeah,
So
they're
while Iran
kind of going for
is
the economic win condition rather than being a loyalist to anyone. Plus, they don't really have that much cultural, ideological overlap with anyone in the region at all. So
exactly. So while the Iranians are disappointed, they really shouldn't be. Like, this was an entirely predictable outcome. This is very much in keeping with China's foreign policy with the region, as it's been for several decades now. And there's been some drama vis-a-vis Chinese weapons allegedly on their way to Iran. Supposedly, a U.S. intelligence source indicated that China is preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran in the next few weeks. This is a report from CNN, so make of it what you will. But CNN reported that there are indications they were going to send, well, for one, that they would send the weapons via third parties, no surprise. But they said that the air defense systems would be man pads, which kind of undermines the seriousness of the threat supposedly posed by this. But news outlets are treating it seriously, and Trump apparently went out of his way after this report to threaten China with 50% tariffs if it helps Iran's military. Are you familiar with man pads?
no.
It's a very goofy acronym that the U.S. military came up with to describe the class of weapons that Stinger missiles are in. You're familiar with Stinger missiles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so shoulder-fired anti-air missiles, that's what man pads are. Don't ask me what the acronym stands for. I don't remember off the top of my head. I would absolutely have to Google it. I'll defer to chat on that. But basically, it's just a very belabored acronym to refer to Stinger missiles. But other countries produce equivalents of shoulder-fired anti-air missiles. I don't recall what China's are, but supposedly this is what they're sending to Iran. If that's true, it really should not be a big deal, because shoulder-fired air defense missiles of this variety are not going to be sufficient to impact American or Israeli air operations over Iran at all. Israeli and American aircraft are flying at altitudes well above what shoulder-fired missiles are going to be capable of getting to. Missiles like that are really more intended for use against helicopters and very low-flying airplanes that are providing air support. They're not designed to go after aircraft that are engaging in what amounts to a modern strategic bombing campaign. So this is not really that threatening, but media has kind of latched onto it to some degree, and now it's a thing. It'll probably go away in a week. That tends to be the fate of stories like this. But for the moment anyway, there is nominally evidence that China is going to help arm Iran, and the Trump administration, or more accurately, Trump himself, is threatening tariffs over it. Okay, we're in the home stretch now. So 2 miscellaneous notes. President Trump said that weapons intended for Iranian protesters were, quote, kept by a certain group and never reached their intended recipients, unquote. This is the first time I'd heard anything like this, and there hasn't been any kind of elaboration after the fact. So this could just be Trump shooting from the hip or bullshitting, I don't know. My impression after the first couple weeks is that the Trump administration did not plan for any kind of long-term operations here. It did not actually think that the Iranian government would stick it out this long. So I'm a little dubious about any evidence that suggests that they were planning, that they had done any real planning for this beforehand. And the idea that they were prepping Kurdish militias to move into Iran is in that category. I don't really buy it, given what I know now. So this is evidence to that effect. It's not Kurdish militias in this case, it's Iranian protesters. but saying that they intended to give them weapons, but the weapons were intercepted or kept by some intermediary that had been intended or had promised to pass them on. That could be true, but it sounds to me more like bullshitting. Trump has been known to make excuses when things blow up in his face, and I could be wrong. This is speculation again, but I suspect this is more rhetoric in that vein. Because I'm not sure why else he would even bother talking about it. But Trump is also not the most rational speaker when it comes to rhetoric in his social media posts in particular, so maybe I'm reading too much into it. And the other miscellaneous item here, Iran is producing Lego movie style propaganda videos online. Have you seen these?
No.
You're missing out. You should absolutely watch one. They're pretty funny. Not necessarily ha-ha funny, but funny as in like surreal.
Mm-hmm.
Like an Islamist authoritarian government commissioned, this is AI stuff, by the way. This is not animation studio produced. This is some company used AI on commission from the Iranian government to produce Lego movie style propaganda. Very strange stuff. Surprisingly high quality, though, from the one I saw. It's actually very coherent, and the animation is pretty decent as well. We're entering a very strange period of history if this is what propaganda is going to look like going forward. It used to be that propaganda designed to appeal to the domestic audience of an enemy was very low quality. Because generally, you don't understand, generally, historically speaking, combatants in a war did not understand their opponents very well, especially domestic politics. So the propaganda targeting them tended to be pretty ham-fisted. It was very obviously propaganda and not very impactful. But this production is higher quality. It still has its issues. It's not great. I don't think it's going to change anybody's mind. But it targets it targets a political sentiment in the United States that already existed. And that alone is a more intelligent approach to this kind of agitprop than what we've seen often in the past, certainly from the Iranian government. So it's worth taking note of, if only for the significance it presents historically, for one of, if not the first, low-budget but high-quality agitprop campaigns by a combatant in a war, if that makes sense. Okay, that's the Iran update for today anyway. For the most part, it's more of the same. Not a whole lot new. The ceasefire talks came, they went, and now we're either set for a resumption of hostilities or we're set for a sort of can-kicking exercise where they continuously extend the 2-week ceasefire until they can reach an agreement. I think one or the other are the most likely possibilities. I did have one other item, but I don't know how much longer we have. How are we doing on time?
Been going for 2 hours.
Yeah, it's another hour then. Okay. Well, we might take a break.
There's a gap in like popular understanding, but I guess this is maybe on the government and military side as well, is there isn't really a clear motivation to get involved in this. Like, I'm comparing it to the Korean War and Vietnam, which it seemed like the ideological answer was we're fighting communism and the spread of communism. And these governments are communists and they're backed by the Soviets and that's our enemy. So that was kind of the answer. It's obviously not a perfect answer, but at least there's a basic reason why we're getting involved in that. Whereas with this one, it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, so there is a rationale to it, but it's very abstract. And Americans in particular don't really like abstract iterations of the American interest. It's not entirely inconsistent with the established American interest in the Middle East as it's been defined historically. I'm trying to kind of prep for this. So the way that the United States government has historically defined its interest in the region is basically, I want to say, threefold. So one is in terms, as you might expect, of energy security. And that kind of had to do with basically energy, oil. I'm talking about oil that was sold directly to the United States. So the United States basically felt it was necessary, strategically speaking, to secure the supply of a critical strategic resource. That was probably the main impetus for American involvement in the Middle East historically. In addition to that, there was also a commitment by the US government to police the global commons. This is the idea that the United States and the United States Navy specifically provides a public good in the form of safe traversal of international waterways. So the US government doesn't necessarily have a treaty obligation to do this, but because the US economy is a major part of the global economy and therefore has global interests in the free flow of travel, securing sea lanes for merchant ships of one kind or another does serve the American interest, in so much as that interest is intertwined with international seaborne commerce.
Which means that instigating Iran to then close the Strait of Hormuz would work counter to that goal, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be correct, but of course there's a conversation there about trade-offs, which I'm kind of steering towards. But yeah, that's securing energy supplies, providing the public good of a global common, providing the public good of internet. Somebody in chat is going to remember the right term here. I'm struggling with it. But basically providing that public good of free travel internationally through seaways. And then the third one is Israel, as you might expect. It's not just Israel. The United States does have security commitments with multiple countries in the region. Saudi Arabia, less so Bahrain, but technically Bahrain too. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and a kind of sort of weird ambiguous relationship with Oman as well. Technically, we also have a similar arrangement with Jordan, but they're not really part of the GCC, so that's kind of a special category. But yeah, there is kind of an arc of American allies that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Gulf, to the Persian Gulf. Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, and also Kuwait, which I forgot to mention. So none of those countries have defense treaties with the United States, but the United States has, as part of its foreign policy, maintained a commitment to their security. And that security commitment basically is designed as part of an overarching security architecture in the region that was built to serve the other two interests that I already elaborated: energy supplies and securing free and open access to the seaways. By having these alliances, the United States is able to build up a military presence in the region that allows them to enforce those interests. And those interests overlap with countries in the region anyway. Securing energy supplies means securing Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc. So maintaining a military presence in those countries that provides for their security, in turn, by extension, also secures the supply of the oil. Now, the commitment to Israel does not serve the interest of securing seaways or oil. However, Israel is much, much more committed to the U.S. Security commitment to the region than the other countries are. Their relationship with the United States, that is to say the GCC relationship with the United States, is much more transactional. You provide security, we provide energy. And there's been a lot of unhappiness in the relationship, both between governments and on a people-to-people level, to a lesser degree, on account of differences in how the respective sides define the contours of that security commitment. The Gulf nations are of the mind that the United States needs to provide maximal security up to and extending to the projection of force into rival states in the region, like Iran. And historically, the United States has been very reluctant to do that because the status quo ante was actually perfectly acceptable to Washington. Even if Iran was still nominally a threat to other nations in the region, in so much as they were supporting revolutionary forces, dissenters, etc., the flow of oil was continuing, and international commerce was continuing through the Strait of Hormuz unimpeded. So those are the two big check marks for Washington. Iran wasn't really fucking with those directly anyway. So the US government then was willing to provide a security commitment to ensure Iran never made a play for control of other countries' oil in the region. But it was not really willing to go to war with Iran to eliminate the threat entirely. Gulf states didn't like that. Israel itself didn't like that. Washington was fine with it. And so that was the status quo for much of the past 50-some years. So that's a rough outline of the status quo. So the alliances with countries in the region, including Israel, kind of serve the broader interests. They overlap. But the conversation gets more difficult and complicated when you consider the past 20 years. Because in the past 20 years, the United States has become self-sufficient in oil, nominally. Not really, it's a little more complicated than that. But basically, the United States produces enough oil domestically to meet the demand in the United States for oil. So that means that there's not as much of an imperative for the United States to secure the oil, quote unquote, from the Middle East. Furthermore, ensuring access to the global commons, right? Free access to seaborne trade. I'm still blanking out on the correct term for that, I apologize. The United States doesn't necessarily need a forward presence to do that. Like, you could do that with a much milder military commitment. The Iranian government knows that if it ever made a unilateral play to close the strait, unprompted, unprovoked, then the United States would intervene harshly. Like, everybody kind of knew that. And that was enough to deter them from doing so. So there was an argument to be made over the past 20 years, and has been made, that the United States should draw down its presence in the region significantly. But the reason it didn't has to do with the fact that even with these caveats, there's still an imperative for the United States to be present. One, in terms of energy, even if the United States is self-sufficient, an actor in the Middle East that were able to monopolize oil production in the region would be able to significantly affect the price of oil on global markets by either increasing or decreasing production significantly. So oil is still a consideration in that vein, even if we don't actually buy oil in the United States from the Middle East all that much anymore. Middle Eastern producers can still impact the price that we pay for it in the US market because the market for oil is global. So the prospect of Iran, say, seizing control of different countries in the region, in the Persian Gulf, and then potentially, if they wanted to, threatening to spike oil prices significantly if the rest of the world, or maybe just the US and Israel in particular, don't do what they want, was a real possibility and threat. So there's an imperative in that regard to continue to maintain the secure supply of oil to the world economy, if not the United States in particular. So that's the imperative. That is the vestigial, so to speak, imperative to secure energy supplies. As far as seaborne trade, you can see that now. Like, even if you don't need as much of a presence in the region to secure the Strait of Hormuz, you do still need to be present. And then there's Israel. So that's, at the end of the day, you do have to come back to it. So even if the relationship with Israel is mostly intended to serve America's other interests in the region, there is a nominal interest that has been expressed by the United States government since Israeli independence in 1948 to try to preserve Israeli independence against aggression from neighboring states. This has been done for different reasons. Nominally, there's sort of the white liberal guilt explanation, which is that a lot of people in the political establishment in the United States felt bad, basically, about the Holocaust and wanted to do something for international Jews, which involved helping them set up a state that could be kind of a refuge for them. Not really that much of a refuge in the grand scheme of things, but they didn't know that at the time. So that's one reason it happened. But another reason is that the United States wanted to cultivate a relationship with the state in the region that was positive. That actually took time. It was not the case that Israel was an American ally immediately after independence in 1948. It actually took about 20 years. It didn't really happen until the 1960s. Before that, Israel actually had somewhat transactional, transient relationships with different countries. In fact, one of the earliest positive relationships they cultivated was with Czechoslovakia, bizarrely enough. So they weren't even entirely in the Western camp early in the Cold War. But later on, they cultivated a closer relationship with France, which was willing to help them both with arms and secretly their nuclear program. It wasn't until the 60s, I think the mid-60s, when they actually really managed to build a positive and strong relationship with the US government. And by then, it had more to do, at least from Washington's perspective, with the Cold War. Obviously, the Soviet Union was backing different Arab nationalist states like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, etc. And lo and behold, these were the states that were the most aggressive towards Israel in that roughly 20, 30-year period after Israeli independence. So that's obviously a problem for the United States. The US government at the time during the Cold War is very, very invested in making sure not only that the Soviet Union does not acquire control over oil resources in the Persian Gulf, it doesn't even want them to get a foothold in the region. And actually, even as the Soviets cultivated ties to states in the region, they were never so brazen to actually set up a significant military base in the region, and that had to do entirely with American deterrence. Like, Washington was very, very hawkish and insistent that any Soviet effort to set up a significant military presence in the region would be met with a harsh response. And Moscow saw that as sufficiently credible to honor that throughout the Cold War. That doesn't mean there were never any Soviet military personnel in the Middle East. They did have technical advisors in Egypt, some aircraft, etc. Certainly quite a bit of spying went on. But there was never like a formal Soviet military base, at least as I understand it. So, trying to reset my memory here. So this is early Cold War. The United States has an incentive to mitigate and minimize Soviet influence as much as possible, owing to the aforementioned energy and freedom of navigation. I think that's the word I wanted. Incentives. And so as part of that, there's an incentive then for Washington to help Israel, because Israel is fighting the allies of the Soviet Union in the region. And so that serves as the foundation for a very close relationship. Before that, the relationship was actually much weaker, and Washington had actually taken a somewhat harder line on the Israeli government and its conflicts in the region. But starting in the mid-60s, and especially with the Six-Day War, Washington was more all in. And at that point, the relationship became very much a Cold War-style relationship, where we cultivated a client state in its conflicts with Soviet client states. Now, after the Cold War ended, there was a question of why. Like, why should we still be committed to Israel? Like I mentioned before, the Israelis acted as a platform from which the United States could project force in the region, and that in turn served the broader American interest in the region, because you need to project force in the region to secure the energy and to secure freedom of navigation rights. And so the relationship with the Israelis kind of helped with that. And the Israelis were also very committed to maintaining a strong military presence in the region that could be used to deter Iranian aggression. And after 1979, Iranian aggression was a major threat to American allies in the region. And after the Cold War ended, they were pretty much the only threat. So insomuch as Israel presented a credible kind of offsetting power in the region, cultivating a relationship with them that would allow them to continue that role was in the American interest. So that was kind of the 90s and the aughts. The Israelis were basically our anti-Iran chip in the region. The Saudis and the other GCC nations had militaries of their own, but they were much weaker and not really credible deterrents to Iranian aggression. They really needed the United States to do that. But the Israelis complemented American power in the region, and to a degree, they could act unilaterally in ways that the United States couldn't, and so they were useful, even if they were very unpopular in the region. So that kind of brings us to the modern era, sort of your Trumpian populist era. And at this point, you can ask credibly why the United States continues to kind of cater to the Israeli interest here. Because while there's an interest in the United States maintaining some kind of relationship with Israel and the GCC in order to defend American interests in the region, it's not clear why we need to, say, fight a war with Iran. Like, America's interest would have been just as well served not doing that. I think given the lack of progress in the Iranian nuclear program, like, I've long been of the mind that if they want to build a bomb, then they should just build one. Kind of having one foot in, one foot out is dumb. Saddam Hussein learned that the hard way. You'd think the Iranians would have learned from that, but apparently they didn't. So I think then the fact that they never got one at this point is evidence that maybe they actually did want to just be a threshold state. Like, maybe they never really wanted to actually get one. They just wanted to be on the precipice so they could threaten to get one as a credible deterrent against any aggression against themselves. So if that's accurate, if that's the case, then the nuclear program is not a sufficient casus belli for the current conflict. I had been of the mind early in the conflict that maybe it was the ballistic missiles, since the United States had long complained about them and saw them as kind of part and parcel with the Iranian nuclear program. But now US negotiators seem to have come back around to the nuclear program in the peace talks, so I don't know. I don't know what the game plan seems to be there. But if we didn't need to worry about the nuclear program, or at least we had successfully contained them to threshold status and deterred them from making a more ambitious move, then you could very easily frame this conflict as being more in the interest of the GCC and Israel than in the American interest. And that argument is being made. So I think if you do want to paint it as in the American interest, you have to emphasize, one, the nuclear program, the threat to America's allies, the potential for a cascading expansion of Iranian influence and control to other oil-producing states in the region, and also just the general Iranian support for proxy militias in the region, which may or may not be legitimate depending on your perspective. All of those items could be argued to be in the American interest. Containing all of those items could be argued to be in the American interest, in so much as they've threatened the abstract American interest in energy flows and freedom of navigation. So that's what I mean. That's what I meant at the start when I said, yes, there is an American interest, but it's abstract. That's the abstraction. It's not a direct pressing American interest, but it's an abstract interest in ensuring that oil prices remain relatively low and are not controlled by any single actor, certainly an actor that could be hostile to the United States, and ensuring that the public commons continues to exist unabridged, and that freedom of navigation on global waterways continues without, say, Iranian interference in the Strait of Hormuz. Does that make sense, or am I rambling?
Kind of makes sense, yeah.
Kind of?
Yeah, I'm also getting attacked in a video game at the same time, so it adds to the confusion factor.
Okay.
It's okay.
Well, this is basically a broad outline, and I'm probably forgetting some details here, but this is a broad outline of the American strategic interest in the region and why we are committed to the region's security to the degree that we are. So there is a rationale to it. It is not completely out of the blue. The issue here is more in terms of this individual conflict. Like, there is a genuine argument to be made that this is badly planned, for one, which is a problem unto itself, but also, strategically speaking, that it doesn't really add up from an American perspective. This is not adding to our security, despite the expenditure of a significant amount of American treasure and weapons. It makes some sense in the context of the nuclear program, but hypothetically, you could have done that without all of this drama. I would point out that the strikes last year significantly set back the nuclear program, and that if it is a concern, you can just mow the grass. You can just do that again if they catch up again later. There isn't any inherent need to go full hog here and try to just utterly annihilate their ability to produce any nuclear-related equipment, or to at least scare them into thinking you're going to try, such that they want to give concessions. That's not really necessary from the American perspective. You could have achieved lesser objectives that still served the American interest and that were much cheaper in terms of expenditures. I apologize if that's confusing. Having to kind of summarize 50 years of American foreign policy strategy is a little taxing. So that's my best effort.
Makes sense.
Did we have any questions for today? We did. Okay. So I'll do the questions here, and then I'll get to one other item that I had, and that'll probably eat up the remaining 20 minutes. Any updates on tensions between Taiwan and China? I think I haven't heard any updates, so I don't think there's been any change. I did read recently that the leader of the Kuomintang in Taiwan, which is their opposition party, basically, did actually meet with a Chinese official. But that's not unusual. The Kuomintang has been pretty chummy with the Communist Party of China for a couple decades now. So I wouldn't read too much into that. I think maybe it signals that Beijing is getting a little smarter about how it deals with Taiwan. They did kind of have that wolf warrior diplomacy era when they were acting tough and being hawkish towards different countries that they had some kind of existing tension with, but that pretty well blew up in their face and they stopped after a while. So I think this is more of a return to the norm. You know, rather than trying to bully Taiwan, they're cultivating relationships with the established political elite, mostly in the Kuomintang, and then trying to kind of pave the way for peaceful reunification later. How long has Iran been a theocratic Islamic state? I keep hearing they were not always Islamic. Okay, so the Islamist state that controls Iran now has only been around since 1979. Before that, they were a monarchy controlled by the Shah of Iran. I think his name was Pahlavi. No, the dynasty was named the Pahlavi dynasty. I forget the name of the individual guy that was in charge. They had been in power for about 100 years, I want to say. Maybe longer than that. I'm flaking out. 100 or 200 years. Not all that long. The Pahlavi dynasty had not been in control of Iran all that long in the grand scheme of Iranian history. And mind you, Iranian history does indeed have a grand schema. That's thousands and thousands of years. There's a lot of history there. And so that's what's kind of tripping me up here, because when you say Islamist, a theocratic Islamic state, there actually have been theocratic Islamic states controlling Iran in the way distant past. Like when Islam first conquered Iran, I think, what was it, like 1,800 years ago, or no, it would have been more like 1,400 years ago? No, longer than, I'm fucking up the time. It was more than 2,000 fucking, it was a long-ass time ago. It was a long time ago when the Muslims first conquered Iran. They set up and, well, no, they didn't set up. They incorporated Iran into the existing caliphate. I think it was the was it the Abbasid Caliphate? I'm not remembering off the top of my head. Somebody in chat will remember off the top, I'm sure. But the first Muslim caliphate incorporated Iran, and at that point you could say that it was run by a theocratic Islamic state. And it continued to be run by Islamist caliphates of one kind or another for several more centuries. I think eventually it was the rule of the caliphates ended with, what was it, with the Mongols? The Mongol invasion in the 1200s, I think. I think at that point it was incorporated into one of the Mongol hordes. And then from there, Persia basically returned to its pre-Islamic trend of having de facto monarchies. I don't think they ever explicitly called themselves kings, though. Well, maybe they did. I think Shah is Persian for king. Somebody in chat, please fact check that for me. Regardless, there weren't really any explicitly Islamist states ruling Iran, I think, after the Mongols. I'm not super well versed in Persian history, so I'm open to, actually, that's a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in foreign policy or economics, so if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this because I can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, but we do enjoy the feedback we get. So please do pitch in and keep me honest on here. So I think the Islamist revolutionary government that took power in 1979 was the first explicitly Islamist state Persia has had since the Caliphate era. And again, it's kind of fuzzy because a lot of the previous shahs had kind of painted themselves as quasi-religious leaders. So it kind of depends on how you want to define theocratic Islamic state. But I don't think anything compares to the current Islamist government, at least from now back to the Mongol invasion period. So it's true that they were not always, I guess that's another part of the question. I keep hearing they were not always Islamic. They've been Islamic for thousands of years. So that's not quite accurate to say they were not always Islamic. Technically, there was a pre-Islamic period of Persian history, that much is true. Before the Muslims invaded, they were Zoroastrian, I'm never sure how to pronounce that. That was the main religion. And yeah, they did have a long by of pre-Islamic civilization there that goes way, way back.
Yeah, and just to clarify again, by Islamic State, we mean a nation where religion is part of the government structure, not that it's a country that is predominantly Muslim. So what you're saying was, after the rise of Islam and stuff, Iran ended up becoming a predominantly Muslim country, but it wasn't governed by an Islamic regime that was theocratic in nature until after the recent Shah of Iran. I guess the secular dictator guy.
Kind of secular, yeah. I mean, you can only be so secular in a society like Persia. You do have to incorporate some Muslim norms and whatnot, and you do have to take into account the Islamic clerisy, which was a major political force pretty much throughout Persia's post-Islamic history. So the Shah is known for being secular, mostly relative to what came after him. But even before the Islamic Revolution, Islam still had a preeminent role in Persian society. The Islamic clerisy was still immensely influential, not nearly as powerful as they were after the revolution, obviously, but the fact that they were able to organize and win a revolution kind of illustrates how important they were even before the revolution. And you can track the political significance of the Islamic clerisy in Iran going back centuries. It's not, they've always been one of the major power brokers in Iran. That's not new. So it's not entirely accurate to say the Shah's Iran was completely secular. It was relatively secular. And certainly the Shah did try to cultivate secular modern society. But that society was not necessarily meant to like preclude the importance of Islam or the Islamic clerisy. They were kind of meant to be side by side. And the fact that it kind of failed illustrated how unpopular that policy was with broad swaths of the population. You know, for the past 100 years, if not even before then, there has been a consistent tension in Iranian politics between reformers and modernists and the traditionalists and the Islamic clerisy on the other. That has been one of the central political tensions. There are obviously many others, but that's definitely been one of them. And the Shah was never able to really deftly navigate those kinds of tensions. Like his focus after he was de facto installed by the West to basically run Iran, that's a whole other conversation. His focus was more on containing Soviet influence in the Middle East, helping the United States, and ensuring the supply of oil. Like that was kind of his job, so to speak, as an American ally and puppet. But over time, he did kind of become more independent, to be fair, and eventually did nationalize the oil in his own right. Again, this is kind of getting off on a tangent, but the Shah did have agency in that relationship, and by the time he was kicked out of power, he had kind of grown out of the role as Western puppet and become his own leader. He had leverage on account of the oil crises of the 1970s, and he used it with great alacrity. But that said, he was still committed to a vision of Iran that was kind of pro-Western, and that involved modernization, economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where he ran into the traditional bloc reformists in Iran had always run into, which is sort of the traditional conservatives in Iran, who were very pious Muslims who did not like the modern world flooding into the country to the degree that it was under the Shah. And because the Shah was running an authoritarian monarchy that didn't give a shit about what people thought, his opinion was that modernity needed to be imposed. He believed that was what would be best for Iran in the long run, and that all of the dissenters on the right needed to be maybe not subjugated per se, although they were. Dissent in the Shah's Iran was violently subjugated by the secret police. But his opinion was that they needed to at least be marginalized to ensure that they did not impede the program of modernization that he believed was necessary for Iran's long-term survival. And that's not a very diplomatic way of dealing with political differences. So unsurprisingly, the result was violence, convulsion, and eventually successful revolution. So I think that's a more accurate characterization than saying that the Shah was secular or saying that they were not Islamic before. They were. Like, Islam and Islamism has always been a part of the Iranian political scene. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. There's some hawks in Israel that have been trying to propagate a rumor that actually Iranians are not very conservative, not very Muslim, and actually they think Jews have superpowers, and it's a whole thing. It's a bizarre narrative that's been making the rounds in some quarters online. But it's not an accurate reading of Iranian politics. It's very incomplete and well, partial and biased in favor of one particular country. That's not to say that there's never been any secular people in Iran. They've even had outright communists. Secular modernists have always had currency within Iranian politics to varying degrees, but they've always had to navigate a very difficult political environment that's involved a traditionalist Islamist conservative faction in Iranian politics that is dead set against modernization. Major landowners in Iran who used to comprise a major elite in Iran, who are also very reluctant to embrace rapid change, and then of course the monarchy, which had its own interests at stake. So that's a very difficult environment to tread without having a large middle class that is economically wealthy enough to kind of pay for its own influence, so to speak. If you want to be a political actor, you got to spend money. And generally, you need an upper middle class to do that in order to build modern institutions that really push and preserve modernity. And Iran hasn't really had a big modern class historically. It's just been too small to really kind of get its own way. The other actors have always been bigger. Certainly, they've never been as strong as the Islamic clerisy. They've kind of proven their mettle politically many times over the past 100 years.
I see.
Let's see. Is Israel allowed to purchase bonds in the U.S. bond market? Yes, as far as I know. I haven't heard anything to the contrary. You've got me curious now. I don't even know why somebody would ask. I've never heard of any kind of prohibition to that effect. I guess I would ask for elaboration on the question. Let's see. Have I ever talked about the weapons the U.S. sent to the Kurds in Iraq at the start of the Iran war? The intent was to use them against Iran. Kurds just said, thanks for the weapons. It did nothing, so we gave them more. They said, thanks again. I don't know if that's true or not. I did talk about this a little bit earlier. This was when Trump was saying that weapons intended for protesters had been intercepted and kept. I suspect that he might have been talking about Kurds, but it's not clear. Yeah, again, I'm very skeptical of anything that suggests that the Trump administration did significant preliminary planning and preparation for this conflict. And giving weapons to Kurds of one kind or another would definitely qualify. So I don't think there's enough evidence to conclude this is an accurate portrayal of what happened. The Kurds themselves certainly seem perplexed by used to anyway, in the first week or two of the conflict, about notions that they had been prepared to invade Iran as part of the operation. Some of them expressed enthusiasm about the prospect, but none of them seemed at all prepared or forewarned about it. So I'm very skeptical that this is something that they actually did. I think more likely Trump made some offhand comments about Kurds helping with the conflict. Kurds were enthusiastic, but then expressed a desire for assistance, like they were asking for a no-fly zone, intervention, logistical support, and the fact that they were asking for all of that suggests that none of it had been planned beforehand, which means that it was just some bullshit that happened on the fly. Trump made some offhand remarks. The Kurds expressed interest. People thought maybe there had been a plan. Then it became very quickly apparent that there was no plan. And then, in particular, the Turkish government expressed extreme dissatisfaction at the prospect of American-backed Kurds doing much of anything, and then that was the end of it. So I don't think it was the case that we gave weapons to the Kurds in the expectation they would do something, and then they didn't, because we fucked them over many times before. Pronunciation-wise, the Wikipedia article for Mark What's-His-Name has an audio button you can push next to his name to hear how it's pronounced. I've heard it before, I just keep forgetting. My brain does not want to accept the correct pronunciation. It is dead set resistant to it. Here, I'll look it up now. It's not going to stick, though. These Dutch names always fuck me over. Rutte. Okay, let's go with that. I've used root, I've used rut, I've used route, but not Rutte. I'm never going to remember that. That's I'm just not familiar enough with Dutch pronunciations of names. They're very foreign to me. But I will try. I'll make an effort. Okay, that's all we had for questions. That's about it for time, so I'm going to squeeze this in right at the end. Maybe that's for the best, because I'm going to get bitched out for this one more than anything else I've talked about on here today.
Whoa.
Yeah, if it's okay with you, it'll probably take 15 minutes over our normal time. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Permission granted? Okay.
Go ahead.
Just want to verify. Okay, so I've seen some people in chat, online, in different quarters talk about how this conflict could augur the end of, quote unquote, the American empire. And the reason being that the conflict is accelerating the decline of said empire because it's going to further incentivize disuse of the dollar in international commerce and further incentivize the use of alternatives. And this is the old notion about the petrodollar being critical not only to the global economy, but to the US economy in particular, and a major leg of American hegemony all over the world. And that the Trump administration is very foolishly here putting that leg at risk by engaging in this operation and by giving the entire world and its various economic actors added reason to trade in currencies other than the dollar. So this is the logic that I've read. And as I've said many times over the past 9, 8, however long, some years we've been doing this segment, the petrodollar is not really a thing. It doesn't matter anymore. So this logic is fatally undermined by this fact. It used to be important in the 70s. Back in the 70s, international trade was much smaller, basically, than it is now. International flows of capital, especially liquid capital, was not nearly as great in the 70s as it is now. It was much more constrained. And in turn, there was much less of it available for people who were looking to borrow money, not just in private markets, but governments. And this is what led the Nixon administration in the 70s to apply significant pressure on the GCC to buy American bonds to alleviate a debt crisis that was occurring in the 70s as part of the overarching energy crisis. So this, more than anything, is what sort of created this narrative that the petrodollar is critical to the American empire, because without it, American finances would collapse. We would not be able to enjoy the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar being a reserve currency. And the US economy would in turn experience the full benefits, the full joys of a debt crisis that would significantly impair the economy, have knock-on political effects, destabilize the United States, and presumably by this logic result in a decline, if not end, to American hegemony. Again, this is the logic. In the 70s, this argument was much stronger because there actually was a significant debt crisis, and it actually was alleviated with petrodollars, with oil money from the Middle East funneled into T-bonds. Since the 70s, petrodollars have weakened considerably in their importance to American T-bonds, as well as to just global finance generally, because there's just way, way more liquid capital sloshing around now. International trade boomed starting in the 1980s, and it really hasn't stopped. Even now, as the global economic growth has declined, it's still at an elevated level. Like, there's an immense amount of interconnectivity between different economies all over the world. And this in turn has resulted in the knock-on effect of creating a global capital market of liquid capital that is orders of magnitude bigger than anything that existed in the 70s. And this has resulted in turn in petrodollars being just relatively less impactful. It's true that more oil is sold and that there's more petrodollars than there used to be, but the rate of increase is just much less than the overall increase in the size of overarching capital markets. So they literally cannot play the role they played in the 70s. It's just mathematically impossible for the Middle East by itself with petrodollars to bail the United States out of a debt crisis if another one were to occur, like the one in the 70s. It's not happening. And that just disproves this notion that the petrodollars are some kind of key ingredient here to American hegemony. Like, they're not. They've obsolesced fiscally as a strategic tool over time. That's not to say they're not useful in general. Like, they still buy a lot of military equipment. They still import stuff from the United States. And it is an overall useful tool strategically for those countries because it gives them a reserve of cash that they can use in an emergency. They're actually using it now. Being cut off from sale of oil to the global market is a big problem if your economy is almost entirely dependent on the export of that commodity. And so they built up rainy day funds that they're using right now. So a lot of those are held in dollars, but not entirely. But it's all petrocurrency, so to speak. So it has strategic uses, but it's not the end all and be all like it used to be. So no, the petrodollar is not going to, the petrodollar shifting away from dollars towards other currencies is not going to undermine the U.S. economy, end American hegemony, et cetera. Like, it's not nearly as important as people like to make it out to be. This is just mostly an old talking point that refuses to die. It used to be relevant, but not anymore. Furthermore, some of the logic here is that the US dollar's value is entirely dependent on oil and the petrodollar, or at least mostly dependent therein. This is also not true. It never really has been. For one, oil producing countries do trade oil primarily in the dollar, but the underlying logic behind the hegemony and collapse rationale is that oil producing countries that sell their commodity in dollars have to in turn turn around and invest those dollars in the US economy and T-bonds in particular. That's not true either. If you sell something and get dollars in return, there's nothing stopping you from exchanging those dollars for other currencies so you can invest in other economies. This is exactly what happens. They don't put everything they get into the US economy. They'll put a portion of it into the US economy, a portion of it into T-bonds, a portion of it into Europe, China, the region itself. It's important to have a diverse portfolio. Anybody in finance will tell you that. The Middle East is no exception. So they've actually already been converting dollars into other currencies for decades. That's not new. It is true that they've been diversifying more away from the dollar and the US economy over time in terms of their portfolio composition. But that's a change of like 70 to 60%. It's not some dramatic like 90% to 30% or something like that. It's an incremental change meant to reflect relative risk. It's not something that's so dramatic that it's going to destroy the underlying value of the dollar. It's certainly not enough to destroy the overarching US economy and US hegemony. So I can understand why people are upset with the Trump administration and don't like that the United States is involved in a conflict with Iran that has very abstract, bizarre rationale behind it. But among the things that it's not going to do is it's not going to end US hegemony. However stupid the war may be and the planning for it, this is not going to destroy the United States.
But you may experience some pain at the pump.
Yeah. Certainly that is in the cards.
Yeah, you're talking about the kind of expansion, the global economy and stuff, and how petrodollars are relatively less. It reminded me of the problem with Texas back in the day, where their economy was overly reliant on oil, and then they invested pretty heavily in tech and stuff, like Texas Instruments and so on is there, which are pretty expensive investments, but it's ended up making Texas a hub for innovation. And the world as a whole, as well as diversifying what it does, like with the advent of technology and the internet and computers and stuff, we have all kinds of ways to provide services to each other, to be entertained by stuff. It's getting more and more diverse. So oil is definitely a valuable source of energy, but it's not quite as fundamental it was when we had a simpler time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope all of that made some degree of sense. I kind of had to do that on the fly. Well, the earlier stuff on U.S. strategy in the region, that petrodollar stuff is stuff we've done before, but it needs to be repeated now and again. People keep bringing it up.
Yeah, and in a way it kind of points to how confusing the whole venture is from the U.S. vantage point. I was talking to someone, I was saying, if we were going to conquer somewhere and there was a bunch of like direct value to harvest, like there's oil that we can take home for ourselves, then at least that's like a greedy, selfish edge. You know what you're going for. It's not good because you're being a conqueror and oppressor and so on, but at least there's a clear win condition. The win condition for this is not super obvious because you're making your own situation worse. Like, yes, we are able to produce as much oil as we consume and a bit more than that, but it still does affect our prices. So I would say more people are less happy than they were as a result of the outcome of this in the US than happier because they're just paying more for stuff. That's kind of the bottom line of the regular person.
Well, the Trump administration is going to argue there will be long-term benefits when Iran capitulates. and that the short-term pain will be justified. That's the angle they're playing anyway. I think that feeds into my earlier theory that I discussed a couple weeks ago when the conflict started, actually, that one of the major underlying impetus for the conflict is that Trump just is thinking about legacy. He wants to solve a long-running problem that other presidents had not been able to solve in American foreign policy. So he's being dramatic so he can cement some kind of place in history for himself by playing IRL Hearts of Iron, as somebody online put it memorably.
Just out here RTS gaming.
Well, thank you for indulging me. I didn't mean to go too over time.
Oh, you're good. There was one question. I don't know if you've seen any of this, kind of as we're wrapping up. Did you see the latest interview with Tucker Carlson with the BBC claiming the U.S.-Israeli relationship is a master-slave kind of relation, and expanding the claim to Starmer as well, stating that neither the U.S. nor the U.K. are sovereign countries at this point in time?
No, I have not seen that, but that sounds exactly like something I would hear from Tucker Carlson. Yeah, I don't buy it. I don't think having an alliance with the Israelis is indicative that they're not fully sovereign countries. You can argue maybe the relationship has skewed America's strategic perceptions. Certainly, the Israeli government is very good at lobbying and convincing people in other governments to help them out. But I don't think you can ascribe U.S. assistance to Israel strategically or tactically or whatever else just down to them being slaves of Israel. Like there's a more complex political there's more complex political action happening there that's driving those outcomes that goes well beyond just secret global Jew conspiracy to manipulate the United States into doing what it wants, which is basically what Tucker Carlson is referencing there. Now, there are people here in the US that just like Israel. Some of them have evangelical Christian reasons for doing so. Some of them themselves are Jews who want to help out Israel. Some of them are not Jews, but are secular peoples who think the US needs to prop up a secular ally in the region. Some people define it civilizationally. Israel is a part of the West. The West is in conflict with the Middle East, and so we need to help a civilizational ally. There's different political actors at play that want to back Israel for their own reasons. And there's enough of them that they can push US strategy to emphasize supporting Israel. But even in the absence of all that, like I mentioned earlier, there are underlying reasons in the region for the United States to be invested in the Middle East, and an alliance with the Israelis helps serve those interests, albeit indirectly and abstractly. You know, there is a rationale to the US alliance with Israel. It's not just conspiracies. Like, there is a strategic impetus there. You may not agree with it, you may not like it, but it exists.
Did you get the disclaimer in?
I did.
Nice, good.
It was later in the episode, but we did it. I did it.
Very good. We get some opposition sometimes in the chat, so sometimes I'm mid-moment in a match and I don't catch it, but it's very nice to have. Just as a reminder, we don't know everything, and the two of us do have a perspective from the United States of America, which is an imperfect country filled with imperfect people like your country. So we're just trying our best to figure stuff out.
Was there anything in particular I was fucking up?
No. Just an independent, I would say, opinionated individual who didn't think we understood the history of Iran very well because, quote, the nuance of Iran's history breaks Western brains.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm not super well versed on Iranian history, so I wouldn't be surprised if I made mistakes. So corrections and clarifications are certainly welcome.
So it goes. Turns out history is pretty deep. And it's hard to know all of it. We have our vantage points. not the nuance. Yeah, but very good. Well, thank you, Chat, for hanging out. Thank you, Fuzzy Code, for landing questions. Thank you, Agent Smith, for your time. We'll see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.